Have you ever wondered why, across thousands of years and countless civilizations, humanity has persistently imagined the divine watching over us? From the earliest cave paintings to our modern houses of worship, this pattern remains strikingly consistent. We create images of gods and then kneel before them. But what if this universal impulse doesn't originate where religious authorities claim? What if the true genesis of God isn't found in the heavens, but in the darkest corners of the human mind? Consider this unsettling possibility. Every divine figure throughout history, from Zeus hurling thunderbolts to the all-seeing God of Abraham, might stem from the same psychological root, a root buried so deep in our collective consciousness that we've never thought to question it. Yet one 19th-century philosopher dared to dig beneath these sacred foundations and discovered something profound. Fear was the first architect of divinity. Picture yourself in a primeval forest as night falls. You're surrounded by sounds you can't identify and threats you can't see. In that moment of terror, doesn't the mind desperately grasp for order, protection, meaning? This instinctive response to existential dread might be the very soil from which all religious thought has grown. What if our gods are simply the shadows our fears cast upon the walls of existence? This isn't merely an academic question. If fear truly birthed religion, it would fundamentally alter our understanding of faith, morality, and human psychology. It would mean that divinity itself, the concept that has shaped civilizations, launched crusades, and comforted billions, originates not from revelation, but from our most primal emotion. The implications are both disturbing and potentially liberating. As we explore this provocative theory, I invite you to set aside defensive reactions and approach this journey with genuine curiosity. After all, isn't understanding our deepest motivations, even the uncomfortable ones, the first step toward authentic spiritual freedom? What truths might we discover if we dare to examine the psychological origins of our most sacred beliefs? When we examine religious traditions across cultures and throughout history, a curious pattern emerges, one that religious institutions rarely acknowledge. Despite their vast differences in theology, ritual, and cultural context, nearly all religions share a remarkably similar emotional foundation. They uniformly address the same fundamental human anxieties: fear of death, fear of suffering, fear of meaninglessness, and fear of cosmic chaos. This consistent emotional underpinning persists whether we're examining ancient polytheistic faiths or modern monotheistic traditions. This pattern becomes even more striking when we analyze how divine figures are portrayed. Gods are consistently positioned as solutions to precisely these fears. They offer eternal life to counter death anxiety, divine justice to address suffering, cosmic purpose to defeat meaninglessness, and supernatural order to tame chaos. This functional similarity exists despite tremendous variation in the specific attributes assigned to these deities. From the vengeful Yahweh to the compassionate Buddha, from Zeus's thunderbolts to Allah's mercy, all serve as psychological countermeasures to the same set of existential terrors. The anomaly deepens when we consider the historical evolution of religious concepts. Archaeological and anthropological evidence reveals that as human societies became more complex and faced new forms of uncertainty, their gods evolved in lockstep. Agricultural societies developed fertility deities precisely when crop failure became a primary threat. Warring nations cultivated warrior gods exactly when military conquest determined survival. Expanding empires conveniently discovered universalist religions that justified their dominion. This correlation between societal fears and theological development is remarkably consistent. Perhaps most tellingly, when we examine conversion narratives, the personal testimonies of those who embrace faith, we find that emotional crisis almost invariably precedes religious awakening. Rarely does someone adopt religious belief through calm, rational deliberation. Instead, conversion typically follows periods of intense fear, grief, loneliness, or existential angst. The pattern is so prevalent that many religious traditions have institutionalized it, creating rituals that deliberately induce fear or disorientation before offering spiritual resolution. This presents us with a profound question that traditional theology struggles to answer. If God created humans with an innate religious impulse, Why does this impulse manifest so consistently through fear rather than through joy, wonder, or rational insight? Why does divine revelation seem to require emotional distress as its catalyst? Is it possible we've reversed the causal relationship, that rather than God creating humans with religious fear, human fear actually created the concept of God? This anomaly caught the attention of one of history's most perceptive philosophical minds. As we'll see, his investigation into this pattern would lead to a radical reinterpretation of religion's origins, one that religious authorities have worked tirelessly to suppress. What was it about this discovery that proved so threatening to established religious power? What happens when we confront the possibility that our deepest spiritual convictions might be elaborate psychological responses to our most primal fears? In the autumn of 1879, a 35-year-old Friedrich Nietzsche found himself wandering the alpine landscapes near Sils Maria, Switzerland. His health was deteriorating rapidly. Blinding migraines, stomach ailments, and near-total vision failure had forced him to resign his professorship at Basel University. Physically broken and professionally adrift, he faced his own mortality with unflinching clarity. Yet it was precisely this confrontation with his deepest fears that positioned him to make an extraordinary psychological discovery. Unlike most philosophers of his era, Nietzsche brought unique qualifications to the study of religious psychology. As the son and grandson of Lutheran ministers, he had been immersed in religious tradition from birth. His childhood home in Röcken was filled with theological debates, biblical exegesis, and the emotional rhythms of faith. The young Friedrich was expected to follow this family tradition into the clergy, and indeed his early education at the prestigious Schulpforter Academy had prepared him for theological studies. But Nietzsche's path took a decisive turn when he encountered the works of Arthur Schopenhauer, whose philosophical pessimism challenged the comfortable religious certainties of his youth. Then, as a young professor of philology, Nietzsche's scholarly examination of ancient Greek texts revealed how religious concepts evolved through history, not as unchanging divine truths, but as human cultural adaptations. This philological training gave him unprecedented insight into how religious language develops and transforms over time. Most crucially, Nietzsche experienced firsthand the psychological dynamics of faith and fear. When his beloved father died of a brain condition when Friedrich was only 4 years old, the family interpreted this tragedy through religious meaning-making. Later, as his own health collapsed in his 30s, Nietzsche faced the same existential terror without the comfort of religious belief. This personal journey positioned him to understand both the emotional appeal of faith and the possible liberation of living without it. During those solitary alpine walks, Nietzsche developed a revolutionary approach to understanding religion. Rather than debating theological claims about divine existence, arguments he saw as ultimately unresolvable, he proposed a more incisive question. What psychological needs does religious belief satisfy? Why do humans create gods? And what function do these divine concepts serve in our emotional lives? This psychological approach would become his signature method, what he called philosophizing with a hammer, testing ideas not for their logical consistency, but for what they revealed about human needs and fears. As Nietzsche's health deteriorated further, he began writing in short, intense bursts between periods of debilitating illness. This fragmented style, aphorisms rather than systematic treatises, reflected his physical limitations, but also allowed a uniquely penetrating form of analysis. Each aphorism approached religion from a different psychological angle, gradually assembling a comprehensive understanding of faith's emotional foundations. In works like Human, All Too Human, Daybreak, and The Gay Science, he developed his thesis about fear as religion's primal source. What made Nietzsche's approach so revolutionary was that he didn't dismiss religious experience as mere superstition. Instead, he respected its psychological power while questioning its metaphysical claims. He understood that religions persisted precisely because they addressed genuine human needs, particularly our need to manage overwhelming fear. But what if humanity could face these fears directly, without supernatural consolation? What unsuspected strength might we discover in ourselves? This was the provocative question that guided Nietzsche's investigation into the fear-based origins of faith. What evidence did he uncover? And why has his analysis remained so threatening to religious authorities for nearly 150 years? Let's examine the trail of clues that led to his profound revelation about humanity's relationship with the divine. The first compelling evidence Nietzsche discovered about fear's relationship to religious belief came from his extensive study of ancient languages. As a philologist, trained at the prestigious University of Leipzig, he traced the etymological roots of words for God and divine across Indo-European languages. What he found was revealing. Many of these terms originally connected to concepts of fear, awe, and trembling. The Latin deus shares roots with words expressing terror and dread. Even the Greek word theos has connections to concepts of fearful wonder rather than benevolent love. This linguistic pattern suggested something profound. The very language we use to describe divinity emerged from our vocabulary of fear. Nietzsche noted in Human, All Too Human that primitive man put himself in a relationship of subjection to nature. He conceived himself and his emotions in the categories of fear. This wasn't merely abstract theorizing. It was grounded in concrete historical evidence from language development. Further evidence emerged from Nietzsche's study of pre-monotheistic religions. He observed that early human societies consistently deified precisely those natural forces they most feared and couldn't control: thunder, earthquakes, disease, predatory animals. In Daybreak, he writes, "The first gods arose out of fear. It was fear that generated them." These early divinities weren't primarily loving creators, but dangerous powers requiring appeasement. This pattern of deifying threats appears consistently across unrelated cultures, suggesting a universal psychological process rather than divine revelation. Nietzsche also identified revealing evidence in religious conversion narratives. When he analyzed accounts of religious awakening across traditions, from Augustine's Confessions to Luther's Tower experience to evangelical testimonies, he found a consistent pattern. Conversion rarely occurred during periods of contentment or security. Instead, spiritual transformation almost invariably followed periods of intense fear, guilt, or psychological distress. In The Gay Science, he observes that people project their fear outside of them into this imagined moral world which they have just cobbled together themselves. The ritual practices of diverse religions provided additional evidence. Nietzsche noted that successful religious traditions invariably include ceremonies that first induce anxiety, then offer its resolution through divine intervention. From initiation rites involving simulated death to confession practices that stimulate guilt before providing absolution, these rituals demonstrate the fear resolution pattern at religion's core. He saw this as evidence that religions don't merely respond to pre-existing fears. They actively cultivate specific anxieties to make their spiritual solutions necessary. Perhaps most compelling was Nietzsche's analysis of how divine attributes mirror human psychological needs. Gods consistently possess precisely the powers that would neutralize human fears. They offer immortality to counter death anxiety, omniscience to manage uncertainty, perfect justice to address suffering, and unchanging order to tame chaos. This perfect correlation between human fears and divine powers suggested to Nietzsche that these deities were psychological projections rather than independent realities. Nietzsche's contemporary anthropologist Edward Burnett Tylor independently reached similar conclusions in his groundbreaking work Primitive Culture, 1871. Tylor found that across indigenous societies worldwide, religious beliefs consistently emerged as explanatory systems for managing fear of unknown natural phenomena. This parallel research supported Nietzsche's psychological analysis, suggesting he had identified a universal human pattern rather than a culturally specific phenomenon. This convergence of evidence, linguistic, historical, psychological, ritual, and anthropological, led Nietzsche to a troubling question. If religious concepts consistently emerge as responses to fear, what happens when we face our fears directly? What potential for human growth and authenticity have we sacrificed by outsourcing our existential courage to divine protectors? As his investigation deepened, Nietzsche would discover how this fear-based religious pattern fundamentally shaped Western moral concepts and social institutions in ways few had dared to acknowledge. As Nietzsche's investigation progressed, he identified a more specific psychological mechanism driving religious creation, what he termed the spirit of gravity. This concept appears prominently in Thus Spoke Zarathustra, where he depicts the human tendency to make life heavier than necessary by converting natural fears into moral obligations and metaphysical burdens. When primitive humans experienced fear of lightning, for instance, they didn't merely feel a natural survival instinct. They interpreted this fear as evidence of divine judgment, requiring moral submission. This transformation of natural fear into metaphysical meaning represents a crucial evolutionary step in religious psychology. Nietzsche traced how early humans moved from simple animistic fear responses to more sophisticated theological systems through this meaning-making process. In The Genealogy of Morals, he demonstrates how the basic fear of suffering evolved into complex theological explanations about divine punishment, salvation, and moral order. This pattern isn't limited to Western traditions. From Hindu karma to Buddhist suffering, diverse religions consistently transform natural fears into metaphysical systems. Particularly revealing was Nietzsche's analysis of how religious fears evolved to remain relevant despite scientific advances. When natural phenomena like lightning or disease became scientifically explainable, religions didn't disappear. They shifted their fear focus to more intangible concerns like moral judgment, existential meaninglessness, or post-death punishment. This adaptability demonstrates the psychological rather than metaphysical foundation of religious fear. In The Antichrist, Nietzsche observes, "What mankind has so far considered seriously are not realities at all, merely imaginations. More strictly speaking, lies arising from the bad instincts of sick natures." Nietzsche found further evidence by examining how religious fear changes across historical periods. During the medieval plague years, religious authorities emphasized divine punishment and apocalyptic fears. During political instabilities, they stressed fears about social disorder and divine kingship. In industrialized societies, they shifted focus to fears of moral decay and loss of tradition. This historical adaptability revealed religion as a psychological tool that adjusts to address whatever fears are most salient in a given era. Through his own life experience, Nietzsche gained unique insight into how religious fear operates in personal crisis. During his father's early death from a brain condition, the same illness that would later afflict Friedrich, he witnessed how his devout family transformed raw grief and fear into religious meaning-making. Later, as his own health collapsed in his 30s, Nietzsche faced similar fears without religious consolation. This personal contrast allowed him to recognize both the psychological comfort religion provides and the potential strength gained by confronting fear directly. A telling case study emerged in Nietzsche's analysis of Pascal, the brilliant mathematician whose wager famously justified faith through probability calculations. Nietzsche saw beyond Pascal's logical arguments to identify the profound existential dread that motivated them. In Daybreak, he observes that Pascal's famous argument reveals a broken, never-healed heart. All religiosity of ancient times appears as a child's play in comparison with the religiosity of Pascal, which has its roots in fear. This insight applies to countless religious thinkers who construct elaborate theological systems primarily to manage their own existential terror. The most provocative evidence came from Nietzsche's observation that religious leaders themselves often reveal the fear foundation of their teachings through their behavior. While publicly proclaiming faith-based certainty, religious authorities throughout history have displayed remarkable anxiety about challenges to their beliefs, responding with censorship, excommunication, or violence rather than confident engagement. This defensive posture suggested to Nietzsche that beneath official doctrine lies profound insecurity about religion's psychological origins. As these evidence patterns accumulated, Nietzsche recognized a profound implication. If fear created religion, rather than religion responding to pre-existing divine reality, then our entire understanding of spirituality might require revision. What would authentic spirituality look like if it began with courage rather than fear? What human possibilities have remained unexplored because we've channeled our existential responses through fear-based religious frameworks? This line of inquiry would lead Nietzsche to his most controversial discovery, the deep connection between religious fear and what he would famously call slave morality, a psychological system that transforms natural human weakness into moral virtue. What if our most cherished moral values themselves originated in fear rather than divine wisdom? As Nietzsche assembled these diverse pieces of evidence, a coherent pattern began to emerge, what he called the psychology of the believer. This pattern revealed a three-stage process through which fear transforms into religious belief, a process that remains remarkably consistent across cultures and historical periods despite vast differences in specific theological content. The first stage begins with primal existential fear, the raw terror of death, suffering, chaos, or meaninglessness that all humans experience. In The Gay Science, Nietzsche describes this initial state. Man finds himself in the midst of the immense, in the eternal rushing and flowing of all becoming and passing away, with a handful of certainties, with some knowledge of the laws of life, but with utter ignorance of ultimate things. This condition generates overwhelming anxiety that demands psychological resolution. The second stage involves a critical psychological maneuver, the projection of this internal fear onto an external cosmic structure. Rather than experiencing fear as a natural response to actual conditions, humans transform it into a meaningful signal within a larger metaphysical framework. Fear of death becomes evidence of eternal judgment. Fear of suffering becomes a test of faith. Fear of uncertainty becomes a call to submission. This projection mechanism appears consistently in religious traditions worldwide, suggesting it fulfills a universal psychological function. The third stage completes the pattern. After projecting fear outward, humans create belief systems that promise to resolve precisely the fears they've projected. These systems offer cosmic solutions to existential problems: immortality to counter death fear, divine justice to address suffering, metaphysical order to manage chaos. Crucially, these solutions require submission to religious authority, creating what Nietzsche called a will to dependence that religious institutions cultivate and exploit. This three-stage pattern, from primal fear to projection to submission, operates beneath the surface of diverse religious traditions. In Christianity, the fear of sin and judgment leads to salvation through Christ. In Buddhism, the fear of suffering leads to liberation through enlightenment. In Islam, the fear of moral chaos leads to submission to divine law. Despite their theological differences, these traditions utilize the same psychological mechanism. Perhaps the most revealing aspect of this pattern is how it creates a self-reinforcing cycle. Religious institutions first heighten awareness of existential fears, then offer themselves as the exclusive solution to those fears. This creates what Nietzsche called a self-perpetuating illusion, a system that generates the very psychological need it claims to fulfill. In Human, All Too Human, he notes that religions first designate as evil a whole bunch of conditions and feelings which, thanks to another perspective, that is, another origin and purpose, appear, and indeed are bound to appear, as extremely valuable. This insight explains why religious belief often intensifies during periods of social upheaval, natural disaster, or personal crisis. These situations activate the primal fears that religion is specifically designed to address, making its psychological appeal particularly powerful when rational security is most threatened. The pattern also explains why religious conversion narratives consistently describe a movement from fear and distress to comfort and certainty through submission to spiritual authority. Nietzsche identified a particularly revealing test case for his theory in the psychological transformation of Paul, Christianity's most influential early leader. Before his conversion, Paul, then Saul, experienced intense anxiety about his inability to fulfill Jewish law, a fear he later projected onto cosmic scale as universal sinfulness. His religious solution involved submission to Christ, transforming his personal psychological struggle into a universal spiritual paradigm. This pattern of personalizing cosmic fear, then universalizing personal solution, appears repeatedly among influential religious figures. As this pattern became clear to Nietzsche, he recognized its profound implications for understanding not just religion, but human psychology itself. If our deepest spiritual and moral convictions emerge from fear projection rather than divine revelation, what does this reveal about human nature? And what alternative possibilities might exist for those courageous enough to face existential fears directly, without the psychological defense mechanisms of religious projection? These questions would lead Nietzsche to his most radical philosophical insight, the concept of the death of God, not merely as a metaphysical claim, but as a psychological liberation. What new human possibilities might emerge when we confront the fear-based origins of our most sacred beliefs? The recognition that fear creates religious belief rather than vice versa carries profound implications for how we understand human psychology, morality, and spiritual potential. Nietzsche explored these implications with unflinching intellectual honesty, revealing how this single insight might transform our entire understanding of the human condition. First and most immediately, this perspective reframes religious experience itself. Rather than dismissing spiritual feelings as mere delusion, Nietzsche saw them as authentic psychological responses to genuine existential challenges. When people report feeling divine presence, moral certainty, or cosmic meaning, they're describing real experiences, not of external divine reality, but of internal psychological processes. In The Gay Science, he writes, "The desire for a guarantor of meaning is what has created our belief in a God. This perspective allows us to honor the subjective power of religious experience while questioning its metaphysical claims. This reframing extends to our understanding of religious texts and teachings. If these emerged primarily as responses to human fear rather than divine revelation, we can approach them as valuable psychological documents rather than metaphysical authorities." Sacred texts reveal profound insights about human anxiety, meaning-making, and moral development. Not because their authors accessed supernatural wisdom, but because they deeply understood the human condition. This view enables a more nuanced appreciation of religious tradition that neither dismisses it as superstition nor accepts it as divine authority. Perhaps most significantly, Nietzsche's insight transforms our understanding of morality itself. If religious moral systems originated as fear management strategies rather than divine commands, we might question whether these systems truly represent the highest human possibilities. In Beyond Good and Evil, Nietzsche suggests that fear-based morality primarily serves the preservation of the community, of forms of subordination which conduce to the prosperity of the community. This perspective invites us to distinguish between morality as social control and ethics as authentic human flourishing, a distinction obscured when moral rules are attributed to divine authority. This recognition reveals a profound psychological challenge. Many virtues traditionally celebrated in religious traditions, humility, obedience, self-sacrifice, contentment with suffering, may actually represent fear-based accommodations rather than aspirational human qualities. In The Genealogy of Morals, Nietzsche provocatively suggests that slave morality emerges when the fearful transform their weakness into virtue, redefining submission as goodness and power as evil. This insight doesn't invalidate these virtues entirely, but invites critical examination of their psychological origins. Nietzsche's analysis also offers a new perspective on religious conversion. Rather than representing spiritual awakening to pre-existing divine reality, conversion might better be understood as psychological reorganization, a reshaping of one's fear responses within a meaning-making framework. This view explains why conversion experiences feel so profound yet vary so dramatically across cultural contexts. The psychological relief is genuine, even if the metaphysical claims are culturally determined. Most radically, Nietzsche's insight suggests an alternative approach to existential challenges, what he called amor fati, love of fate. Rather than projecting fears onto cosmic metaphysics, humans might directly confront life's uncertainties with courageous affirmation. In Ecce Homo, he writes, "My formula for greatness in a human being is amor fati, that one wants nothing to be different, not forward, not backward, not in all eternity." This represents not rejection of spirituality, but its profound transformation, from fear-based submission to courageous affirmation. This perspective reveals why religious authorities have found Nietzsche so threatening. His analysis doesn't merely challenge specific theological claims, but exposes the psychological mechanics beneath religious authority itself. If fear creates gods, then reducing human fear, through security, education, psychological development, or philosophical insight, might naturally diminish religious dependency without requiring direct confrontation. The implications extend beyond individual psychology to social and political realms. If religious institutions function primarily as fear management systems, their social influence naturally increases during periods of crisis, war, economic instability, or cultural upheaval. This explains the historical pattern of religious resurgence during societal disruption, and suggests that creating more materially secure and psychologically resilient societies might naturally reduce dependency on religious fear management without requiring anti-religious campaigns. As we'll see, these implications lead to a profound question about human potential. What might be possible for individuals and societies that confront existential fears directly, without the psychological defense mechanisms of religious projection? This question points toward what Nietzsche called the revaluation of all values, a fundamental reconsideration of human possibilities beyond the constraints of fear-based morality. The recognition that fear generates religious belief rather than vice versa reveals a more profound pattern, what Nietzsche identified as an organized conspiracy against life, perpetuated not through conscious deception, but through psychological mechanisms that operate beneath conscious awareness. This pattern extends far beyond formal religious institutions into cultural, educational, and political systems that maintain fear-based control. At its core, this unconscious conspiracy involves a systematic devaluation of the physical world in favor of imagined metaphysical realms. Nietzsche traces this pattern to Plato's philosophy, which positioned the material world as mere shadow of an ideal realm, but shows how religious traditions amplified this devaluation to unprecedented levels. By teaching followers to fear and distrust their bodies, natural desires, and physical existence, religious systems create a psychological dependency on metaphysical authority for guidance, validation, and meaning. This pattern becomes particularly visible in attitudes toward the body. Across diverse religious traditions, from Christian mortification of the flesh to Hindu asceticism, physical existence is portrayed as spiritually suspect, requiring control and purification by higher authority. In Thus Spoke Zarathustra, Nietzsche writes, "Once the soul looked contemptuously on the body, and then that contempt was the supreme thing. The soul wanted the body meager, ghastly, and starved. Thus it thought to escape from the body and the earth." This systematic body fear creates perpetual anxiety about natural human experiences, driving dependency on religious management systems. The conspiracy extends to emotional life, where natural human feelings, desire, anger, pride, joy, and power are reframed as spiritually dangerous. Religious traditions consistently characterize certain emotions as sinful or spiritually impure while elevating others, particularly submission, humility, and detachment, as virtuous. This emotional regulation serves to redirect human psychological energy away from challenging authority and toward internal self-policing. The person who fears their own emotional responses becomes dependent on external moral guidance. Perhaps most insidiously, this pattern colonizes the realm of meaning itself. By positioning the source of meaning outside physical existence in metaphysical realms, accessible only through religious intermediaries, this system creates existential dependency. Individuals come to believe they cannot find purpose, value, or significance through direct engagement with life, but must receive these through authorized channels. In The Antichrist, Nietzsche observes, "When the center of gravity of life is placed not in life, but in the beyond, in nothingness, then one has taken away its center of gravity altogether." This unconscious conspiracy operates through specific psychological mechanisms that Nietzsche identified with remarkable precision. First is what he called ressentiment, the transformation of natural fear and weakness into moral virtue through psychological inversion. When the physically weak or socially powerless cannot directly confront threats, they create value systems that define their weakness as spiritually superior. This doesn't happen through conscious deception, but through genuine psychological reorganization. The second mechanism involves what Nietzsche termed bad conscience, the internalization of fear as self-judgment. Rather than experiencing natural fear responses to external threats, individuals learn to fear themselves, their bodies, desires, thoughts, and natural impulses. This internalized fear becomes a perpetual self-surveillance system that religious authorities can then manage and direct. In The Genealogy of Morals, he describes how humans became an animal that was permitted to promise through this self-monitoring psychology. The third mechanism operates through language itself, specifically through binary oppositions that structure religious thought: good, evil, sacred, profane, spirit, flesh, eternal, temporal. These conceptual divisions don't merely describe reality, but actively shape psychological experience, creating artificial separations within human consciousness. By controlling these fundamental categories, religious systems determine how followers experience and interpret their own existence. What makes this pattern truly a conspiracy, rather than merely a psychological tendency, is its systematic reinforcement through institutional structures. Religious education systems instill these fear patterns during early psychological development, before critical thinking capacities mature. Ritual practices strengthen the emotional associations between fear and moral meaning. Social enforcement mechanisms, from subtle disapproval to formal excommunication, punish those who question these patterns. Political alliances between religious and governmental authorities ensure state protection of these psychological control systems. The ultimate evidence of this conspiracy's effectiveness is that its subjects actively defend and perpetuate it, believing they act from free spiritual choice rather than conditioned fear response. The system creates what Nietzsche called willing slaves, who vigorously defend their psychological chains as sacred truths. This self-perpetuating quality represents the most sophisticated form of control, one that operates not through external force, but through internal psychological restructuring. This perspective reveals why Nietzsche's analysis has provoked such intense resistance from religious authorities. He didn't merely challenge specific theological claims, but exposed the entire psychological infrastructure of religious control. By revealing how fear generates gods rather than gods generating fear, he offered a path towards psychological liberation that requires no direct confrontation with religious authority, merely the courageous examination of one's own fear responses. What happens when individuals begin recognizing these patterns in themselves? What possibilities emerge when we confront existential fears directly, rather than through religious projection? And why has this alternative approach been so systematically suppressed throughout Western history? The recognition that fear creates religion, rather than vice versa, represents a fundamental threat to religious authority, not merely challenging specific doctrines, but exposing the psychological mechanics underlying religious control itself. This explains why this insight has been systematically suppressed through various mechanisms, though never completely eliminated. The first and most direct suppression method has been straightforward censorship. Nietzsche's works faced significant publication challenges during his lifetime, with publishers refusing manuscripts they deemed too controversial. After his death in 1900, his sister Elisabeth Förster Nietzsche selectively edited his writings, removing his most pointed religious criticisms while emphasizing elements that aligned with emerging German nationalism. This editorial distortion created a false image of Nietzsche that persisted for decades, obscuring his psychological analysis of religion's fear foundation. Beyond direct censorship, religious institutions deployed a more subtle tactic: misrepresentation. Rather than engaging with Nietzsche's psychological analysis, critics portrayed him as simply advocating nihilism or amorality. By reducing his nuanced psychological insights to simplistic caricatures, religious authorities created strawman versions of his arguments that could be easily dismissed. This pattern continues today, with many religious educational institutions presenting Nietzsche primarily as a moral relativist rather than a psychological investigator of religious fear. Perhaps the most effective suppression method has been philosophical compartmentalization. Academic institutions, often with religious foundations, segregated Nietzsche's ideas into specialized philosophical disciplines disconnected from practical religious life. His work became something studied by professional philosophers rather than engaged with by ordinary believers questioning their own faith. This academic isolation prevented his psychological insights from threatening established religious institutions, by keeping them confined to theoretical discourse. Religious authorities also employed psychological inoculation, teaching followers to fear questioning itself. By characterizing doubt as spiritually dangerous and intellectual curiosity as potential corruption, religious education systems create preemptive psychological barriers against encountering challenging ideas. This inoculation explains why many religious followers experience intense anxiety when exposed to critiques like Nietzsche's. They've been conditioned to fear the very process of questioning as spiritually contaminating. The academic world contributed to this suppression through methodological division. By separating philosophy, psychology, and religious studies into distinct disciplines with different methods and questions, academic structures prevented the kind of integrated analysis Nietzsche pioneered. Philosophical questions about religious truth became disconnected from psychological questions about religious function, allowing the fear foundation of faith to remain unexamined within academic religious studies. Perhaps most insidiously, religious institutions incorporated watered-down versions of Nietzsche's critique into their own teaching, neutralizing its revolutionary potential. By acknowledging that some religious belief might involve psychological projection, while maintaining that true faith transcends such mechanisms, religious thinkers created immunity against the full implications of his analysis. This partial incorporation allowed institutions to appear intellectually sophisticated while preserving their fundamental authority. These suppression methods succeeded partly because Nietzsche himself suffered biographical misfortune that limited his influence. His mental collapse in 1889, likely due to syphilis, prevented him from developing and defending his ideas during their initial reception. Unlike other influential thinkers who actively promoted their work throughout long careers, Nietzsche's active philosophical life lasted barely 2 decades and ended before his ideas gained significant public attention. This truncated career made his work particularly vulnerable to misrepresentation. The historical timing of Nietzsche's work also contributed to its suppression. His most productive years coincided with rising European nationalism and militarism that would eventually culminate in World War I. These political movements often aligned with traditional religious authorities against cosmopolitan intellectualism, creating a cultural environment hostile to psychological analysis of religious foundations. Later, the catastrophic misappropriation of selected Nietzschean ideas by Nazi propagandists, facilitated by his sister's selective editing, created lasting associations that further distracted from his psychological insights about religion's fear foundations. Many potential readers dismissed his work entirely due to these manufactured connections rather than engaging with his actual analysis. What makes these suppression methods particularly effective is that they operate not just through institutional power, but through psychological resistance in individuals themselves. Nietzsche understood that humans actively avoid recognizing the fear foundations of their beliefs because this recognition threatens their psychological security. In Beyond Good and Evil, he observes that the strength of a person's spirit would then be measured by how much truth he could endure, or more precisely, to what extent he needs to have it diluted, disguised, sweetened, muted, falsified. This willing self-deception makes external suppression unnecessary in many cases. This psychological resistance explains a curious historical pattern: the periodic rediscovery and subsequent resuppression of Nietzsche's insights. Each generation produces scholars who rediscover his psychological analysis of religion, generate temporary intellectual interest, then face renewed institutional resistance that marginalizes these insights before they can transform mainstream religious understanding. This cycle played out with the existentialists in the mid-20th century, with postmodern philosophers in the late 20th century, and continues today. The suppression continues even in seemingly progressive religious contexts. Liberal theological traditions often acknowledge the psychological dimension of faith while maintaining that authentic religion transcends these mechanisms. By conceding the psychological aspects of primitive or fundamentalist religion while exempting their own sophisticated theology from the same analysis, these traditions create an artificial boundary around Nietzsche's insights, preventing their full application. What makes this pattern particularly troubling is that it operates largely without conscious conspiracy. Religious authorities who resist psychological analysis of faith's fear foundation genuinely believe they protect sacred truth rather than institutional power. The censorship, misrepresentation, compartmentalization, and psychological inoculation happen through sincere defense of cherished beliefs, rather than calculated deception. This sincerity makes the pattern harder to recognize and address. Yet despite these suppression methods, Nietzsche's insights have persisted, continuing to influence cultural understanding of religion through both direct and indirect channels. From Freud's psychological analysis of religion to existentialist philosophy to contemporary neuroscientific studies of religious experience, his core insight about fear's relationship to faith continues to resurface in new forms. The very persistence of this pattern, despite sustained institutional resistance, suggests it contains a psychological truth too fundamental to permanently suppress. The modern world presents unique challenges to this suppression pattern. Mass education, global communication, declining religious authority, and increased psychological sophistication make traditional methods of controlling information less effective. As more people gain direct access to Nietzsche's writings and the intellectual tools to engage with them, the recognition of religion's fear foundation becomes increasingly difficult to contain within academic or theological boundaries. This growing recognition doesn't necessarily threaten religion itself, but rather transforms our understanding of its psychological function. By acknowledging the fear-based origins of religious concepts, we might develop more conscious and intentional relationships with spiritual traditions, appreciating their psychological wisdom, while transcending their fear-based limitations. What might emerge isn't the abolition of religion, but its profound transformation from unconscious fear management to conscious existential engagement. Have you noticed how religious authorities respond when confronted with psychological analyses of faith? Do they engage with the evidence and reasoning, or do they deflect through appeals to authority, tradition, or moral consequences? This response pattern itself provides evidence for Nietzsche's thesis. If faith rested on firm foundations independent of fear, why would psychological analysis provoke such defensive reactions? The profound implication of Nietzsche's discovery isn't that religion is false, a claim that would remain trapped within religious frameworks of truth and falsehood. The revelation is simultaneously more unsettling and more liberating. We created our gods from our fears, and in doing so, we've been concealing our own creative power from ourselves. The divine authority we've placed above humanity is actually a projection of human psychological needs. Our longing for order, meaning, justice, and eternity transformed into cosmic metaphysics. This recognition leads to what Nietzsche called the death of God, not merely a metaphysical claim about divine existence, but a psychological event within human consciousness. When we recognize that fear created our gods, something fundamental changes in our relationship with existence. The authority we projected outward returns to its source, and we face the dizzying responsibility of creating meaning without metaphysical guarantees. As Nietzsche writes in The Gay Science, this recognition means the sea, our sea, lies open again. Perhaps there has never yet been such an open sea. This open sea represents unprecedented human freedom, not freedom from natural limitations or mortality, but freedom from the psychological confinement of fear-based metaphysics. By recognizing how fear generated religious frameworks, we gain the possibility of relating to our existential condition more directly and authentically. Rather than projecting our fears onto cosmic authorities who demand submission, we might face life's uncertainties with what Nietzsche called the courage for the forbidden, the willingness to experience existential challenges without metaphysical consolation. What emerges from this recognition isn't nihilism, but a profound affirmation that Nietzsche called amor fati, love of fate. Rather than requiring metaphysical guarantees of meaning, justice, or eternity, this perspective embraces life precisely in its uncertainty, impermanence, and complexity. In Ecce Homo, he describes this as not merely bearing what is necessary, still less concealing it, but loving it. This represents not the rejection of spiritual experience, but its transformation, from fear-based submission to courageous affirmation. This perspective offers a fundamentally different approach to life's existential challenges. Instead of managing death anxiety through beliefs about eternal afterlife, we might face mortality directly, allowing its reality to intensify our appreciation for life's preciousness. Instead of requiring cosmic justice to make suffering meaningful, we might engage with suffering as an intrinsic aspect of existence that deepens rather than diminishes our humanity. Instead of demanding metaphysical guarantees of meaning, we might recognize meaning-making as an inherently human creative activity. This approach doesn't reject the psychological wisdom embedded in religious traditions. Many religious practices, meditation, contemplation, community ritual, ethical reflection, offer valuable tools for human flourishing, independent of metaphysical claims. By distinguishing these psychological tools from their fear-based frameworks, we might develop what Nietzsche called a psychology of the future, approaches to human flourishing based on affirmation rather than fear, creation rather than submission. The implications extend beyond individual psychology to social and political realms. Many of our cultural institutions, educational systems, legal structures, political hierarchies, incorporate assumptions from fear-based religious frameworks. By recognizing these foundations, we gain the possibility of reimagining social structures based on human flourishing rather than metaphysical authority. This doesn't mean rejecting all traditional values, but examining them critically to distinguish life-affirming elements from fear-based limitations. What makes this perspective particularly relevant today is that we're living through what Nietzsche predicted, a historical period where traditional religious frameworks are losing psychological authority without clear alternatives emerging. Many people find themselves in an uncomfortable middle space, no longer finding traditional faith convincing, but not yet developing alternative approaches to existential challenges. This transitional state creates both danger and opportunity, the risk of nihilism, but also the possibility of unprecedented human development. The most profound question we face isn't whether God exists, a metaphysical question that remains perpetually unresolvable, but how we might live when we recognize the psychological origins of our gods. What kind of humanity becomes possible when we neither project our fears onto cosmic authorities nor fall into nihilistic despair, but instead embrace our creative responsibility for meaning-making? This question points toward what Nietzsche called the overhuman, not a superior biological type, but a psychological possibility for those who transcend fear-based metaphysics. If you've followed this investigation with genuine openness, you've likely experienced both uneasiness and liberation, the natural responses to recognizing the fear foundations of our deepest beliefs. This recognition doesn't require abandoning spiritual experience, but invites a more conscious relationship with it, distinguishing psychological wisdom from metaphysical claims. What matters isn't whether you accept or reject Nietzsche's analysis, but whether you engage with it honestly, allowing it to illuminate your own relationship with fear, meaning, and belief. I invite you to continue this philosophical investigation by exploring these questions in your own experience. How do your beliefs, religious or secular, function to manage existential fears? What aspects of life have you avoided facing directly by projecting them onto metaphysical frameworks? What possibilities might emerge if you engaged with existential challenges more directly and courageously? Share your reflections in the comments below, as this conversation represents exactly the kind of philosophical community Nietzsche envisioned, people exploring fundamental questions together without requiring metaphysical certainty. If this analysis has provided you with a new perspective on the psychological foundations of religious belief, consider subscribing to continue this philosophical journey. Each video explores how seemingly fixed truths often have surprising psychological origins, helping us become more conscious participants in our own meaning-making. By understanding how we've created our gods from our fears, we might develop more authentic relationships with both our spiritual traditions and our human potential. The final question isn't whether God exists, but what becomes possible when we recognize our own role in creating divinity. As philosophical investigators in this post-metaphysical era, we face both greater responsibility and greater possibility than any previous generation. The recognition that fear created our gods doesn't end spiritual inquiry, but transforms it from submission to external authority to conscious participation in the ongoing human project of creating meaning in an uncertain world. This recognition doesn't diminish human existence, but reveals its profound creativity and courage.